I wanted to do a couple of things. One is some of you are new to POS, so I want to do a 2-minute introduction for you about what we're about. 10 years ago, we started the center, and it was a very, very basic notion, and that is, what happens if you stop asking, what does it look like when it's normal, whatever it may be? And you ask the question, what does it look like when it's at its very best, when it's extraordinary? From that, a major effort began to evolve. It's been a 10-year journey. Last year, we received a major award for impact on research in the academy because there's probably 300 or 400 people now who use that lens to do their research around the globe. This summer, we received another award from the Academy for research with impact on practice, which was amazing given some of the long-established research centers that were in competition for that award. So it's been a wonderful journey. POSLinks is our attempt to get to the community on the campus and elsewhere in terms of helping you, make you aware of things that are going on in the positive research community. As Chris mentioned, we've been doing positive organizing for 10 years. Last year, a new conversation emerged, and that was, what happens if you take the positive lens beyond management and organization and you take it to other disciplines in the business school? In other words, what would positive business look like in terms of research? So Anjan's here from finance to start us off this semester. Rick Bogozzi will talk to us about the positive lens in marketing. George Seidel will talk about the positive lens in law. Now, that's getting really radical. And Wally Hopp, who is here, will be talking next semester on the topic of operations and the positive lens. This is a very exciting movement. I believe that as it unfolds, it'll be 10 times bigger than what's happened in the last 10 years because it's a much more comprehensive phenomenon. So that's very exciting to us. With that, I'd like to introduce Anjan. You've seen his credentials in the materials we sent out. He is currently a chaired professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Previously, he was chair of the finance department here at Michigan. He's been on the nominating committee for the Nobel Prize. The Financial Times ranked finance professors by number of A-level journal articles published. Anjan was number 4 on that list for the last 50 years. So any professor who's published in the last 50 years, Anjan was the number 4 person on that list, which is just an astounding accomplishment. So we have a very, very prestigious and well-known person speaking to us. But there's something else I need to say about Anjan. In order to do that, I want to read you a paragraph, a long paragraph, 1 page, from Daniel Hanneman's recent book on the thinking process. This is probably the longest introduction I've ever done, Anjan. It's usually a 2-sentence process. In 2002, Hanneman Tversky won the Nobel Prize. He published this book this year, and in the book there was an introduction in which he describes his relationship, the relationship that the two of them had. As I read this, I'd like you to really listen carefully to this rather amazing statement. I think it has everything to do with POS. Jane Dutton comes to mind as I read this. And then there's another reason for reading it. Amos and I discovered that we enjoyed working together. Amos was always very funny, and in his presence, I became funny as well. So we spent many hours of solid work in continuous amusement. The pleasure we found in working together made us exceptionally patient. It is much easier to strive for perfection when you're never bored. Perhaps most important, we checked our critical weapons at the door. Both Amos and I were critical and argumentative. he even more than I. But during the years of our collaboration, neither of us ever rejected out of hand anything that the other said. Indeed, one of the great joys I found in the collaboration was that Amos frequently saw the point of my vague ideas much more clearly than I did. Amos was the more logical thinker, with an orientation to theory and an unfailing sense of direction. I was more intuitive, rooted in the psychology of perception, from which we borrowed many ideas. We were sufficiently similar to understand each other easily, and sufficiently different to surprise each other. We developed a routine in which we spent much of our working days together, often on long walks. For the next 14 years, our collaboration was the focus of our lives. And the work we did together during those years was the best either of us ever did. We quickly adopted a practice in which we invented questions and jointly examined our intuitive answers. Each question was a small experiment. We carried out many experiments in a single day. Now he finishes that paragraph and he writes a very interesting sentence. Amos and I enjoyed the extraordinary good fortune of a shared mind that was superior to our individual minds, and a relationship that made our work fun as well as productive. Now, I read that paragraph to you for two reasons. One, I believe that is the very essence of positive organization. Two, that's the very essence of my relationship with Anjan Thakor. We've spent the last, 15 to 20 years on many exciting adventures together, ranging from executive education classes to chasing executives around a table in England under most bizarre circumstances, to an infinite number of conversations like the one I just described to you. Anjan comes from finance. I don't have any idea what he's talking about 90% of the time. And he doesn't have any idea what I'm talking about. But one of the amazing things is he's always interested. And early in the morning or in a cafe in New York City in the middle of the day, after he's been to the restroom, he comes back and he says, "I was just thinking," and he lays out some notion that I only half understand. And I say, "You know what that does? That makes me think of," and I tell him the most bizarre life story, and he looks at me and he thinks about it, and he says, "You know, there's economic implications to that." And the conversation goes on in the most bizarre ways, and amazing things come of it. My relationship with Anjan Thakor is one of the more satisfying relationships of my life. He stimulates me intellectually, and he enlarges me in every way. I want you to know that, and I want you to know you're going to spend the next hour with a very special person, Anjan Thakor.
Wow. I was not prepared for that introduction. So, all right, thank you, Bob. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here. It's good to be back. This research, I guess, goes back to November of 2010, when Bob and I were sitting in my living room in St. Louis, and he was visiting for an occasion that I can't even remember why now. Oh, that must be it, yeah. But we were sitting there, and I hadn't seen Bob for 3 years. He'd gone off to Australia. We hadn't talked since he'd been back. So my interest was in finding out what he'd been doing for 3 years. And as he told me his stories, and as I absorbed all that, my mind was working on processing all that. And then at the end of the stories, I said, you know, we need to do some research on this. And Bob is looking at me like, what the heck are you talking about? And I said, no, you just described the sense of higher purpose that motivated you to do what you did. And I think that there are economic consequences to organization leaders pursuing a sense of higher purpose that somehow intersects with and affects the business decisions that they make. Now, it wasn't quite as well articulated as this was. It was probably a jumbled mess. I don't remember what I said. But it set off a series of conversations since then that then eventually culminated in working on this. We've been working on this now for about a year and a half. We've done about 30 interviews. So the first step was trying to lend economic content to these ideas, which wasn't easy, at least not for me. And then iterating back and forth and getting it into a shape that would make sense to somebody in economics or finance who would read it. And then we followed up and said, we need to get a better sense of how organization leaders think about these issues, not just the two of us. And so since then, we've embarked on a series of interviews in different places, and we've done about 30 of those. And interacting with Bob in those interviews is always enriching. So we would make up a list of 8 or 10 questions that we spent hours on coming to agreement on, walk into an interview, and I always deferred to Bob to do the interviews because my interviewing abilities pale in comparison to his. So I just sit there and take notes, and he asks all the questions. And within about the first 2 minutes, the whole game plan has been abandoned, and Bob is off, asking questions that are not on the sheet. And we would spend, an hour or two and get some of the most incredible stories, some of which I'll share with you. But it's been a tremendous journey, a great learning experience. I hope that the talk today is a dialogue, and I'm very interested in your reactions to some of the things that have emerged. This is still research at a very early stage, so we're still forming our ideas. So whatever feedback you have is going to be enormously helpful. All right, so let me start by motivating this and saying that even within economics, some economists are beginning to ask questions that basically cut to the heart of the core philosophy of economics. And these are very fundamental questions that economists have been debating in a very different light recently. And that is, what is the central purpose of firms in economics? That means the traditional viewpoint is that they should only be concerned about maximizing wealth. Shareholder value is sort of the perspective in finance. Or should they also care about improving the lot of mankind? Okay, doing something that goes beyond wealth maximization. Now, there are people who would say that this is a phony question because they're both one and the same thing. That if a firm attends to wealth maximization, it's also going to improve the lot of mankind. These are not conflicting objectives. So the affiliated question, the smaller question is, are these two goals one and the same, or do they sometimes diverge? Okay. Now, part of the motivation for this question comes from the fact that there are a lot of people who are concerned about global poverty and suffering, and these are pressing issues. And there's a very interesting book that was actually brought to my attention by Bob, by Umair Haque, called Betterness, Economics for Humans, in which he provides some pretty well-known but still shocking statistics about global human suffering. So 20% of the world's population is undernourished. That's more than 1.5 billion people. More than 9 million people die every year from preventable diseases. Half of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. The definition of poverty outside of the U.S. is very different from our definition, which is about $24,000 a year. More than 1 billion people do not have access to fresh, drinkable water. And more than almost 2.5 billion people lack access to normal toilets. And this is just a small sampling of the statistics about how the rest of the world lives. And there are many people who think that we can find some of the answers to these questions from corporations. And now there are some who believe that the way that economists think actually stands in the way of finding answers to these questions. So Umair Haque argues that contemporary economic thought stands in the way of finding the right answers because it makes us prisoners of a paradigm whose linchpin is output. What really counts is seeking Ricardian profit through Fordist work in slow night organizations that sell Marshallian products to be mutually consumed. Now, I don't agree with this because it insults a lot of people I respect and a lot of organizations that I respect, but it is a point of view that is out there about how economics thinks about issues. And I think it's a point of view that at least we need to acknowledge. Now, there are a number of economists who have begun to ask this question in a somewhat different light. So Schiller and Schiller, these are two leading economists, published a paper last year in the American Economic Review, which is our top economics journal. And they make the case that economics should become what they call a moral science. Okay? And they go on to explain what that means. Benabou and Tirole, and keep that name in mind, Jean Tirole is, before too long, probably going to win the Nobel Prize. So he's one of these are two leading economists, have developed a theory of pro-social behavior in which a concern for reputation and self-respect leads to socially desirable behavior. And so many of these papers in economics, and these are not the only papers, focus on instances of divergence between what economists would refer to as private wealth maximization, whether it's a corporation or an individual, and social welfare, seeking to make this world a better place to live. Now, why is it that some people think that economics is not yet a moral science? And part of the reason is that if you look at the two most influential pillars of thought in contemporary economics, and these, by the way, just in the interest of full disclosure, is where most of my research the past 25 years has been in these two areas, is agency and asymmetric information, and it's hard to pick up a paper in economics and finance today that doesn't touch on these issues. They both focus on strategic, self-interested behavior, either at the individual level or even at the level of the organization, and how all of the distortions that this creates can be reduced through various contracting mechanisms. Okay? And so in the standard economic paradigm, when we say that somebody's rational, what we mean is that they maximize their own utility or maximize their own wealth. And then the idea is, and this goes back to what I said earlier, the idea is that if you just aggregate, so if each of us is maximizing our own welfare, and if you just add everything up, then through aggregation, society's welfare is also maximized. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of the standard argument, right? So the central paradigm, as some people would describe it, is to be the best in the world. And those who are in the social welfare camp would argue, no, it should be to be the best for the world. So there is this, the question is, what's the difference between doing things that make you the best in the world versus doing things that make you the best for the world? And so that's a theme that I'm going to explore a little bit. And it's actually tricky, as I'll show you in a few minutes. So what do we do in this paper? So in this paper, we pose the following question. We say, what if an organization leader had a sense of higher purpose that intersected with the usual business goals? And you can define them whichever way you want, profit maximization or shareholder value or market share, whatever the usual business goals are. Now, this is not about charity. So we're not talking about the Bill Gates Foundation, giving money to charity, because that in itself doesn't have anything directly to do with the business of Microsoft. We're more interested in the intersection of the sense of higher purpose with the usual business goals. Okay? So what would be the economic consequences of doing this? And we are not, so one of the things that I would like to point out is that our paper is not a prescription about what's the right approach. That means we're not going to have anything to say about whether pursuing just shareholder value maximization or wealth maximization is the right approach, or whether pursuing higher purpose in conjunction with wealth maximization is the right approach. So we're not being prescriptive here. What we're interested in is how do these two intersect? So how does the intersection of business goals with the pursuit of higher purpose affect the way that organizations make decisions? And if you have some organizations that do that and others that are just pursuing wealth maximization and they're interacting in the marketplace, what are the economic consequences of that? So it's more an exploration of the consequences of this sort of behavior as opposed to being prescriptive about what's right. Yeah? Now, there is a point that I would like to emphasize, which is, what do we mean by, let me skip the slide. Yeah. Okay. All right. So here is, and I do want to point out that we do make a distinction between the pursuit of higher purpose, or between wealth maximization and myopic profit maximization. So there are people who go around saying, I'm not interested in shareholder value maximization because if you do it at the expense of shareholders and employees, then it's just myopia, and that's not what we're about. Our wealth maximizers in this paper are those who actually attend to the needs of customers and employees. Okay, it's just that the reason why they're attending to the needs of customers and employees is that is the long-term meaning of shareholder value maximization. So we're not really interested in the Bernie Madoffs of the world or people who have a 1 or 2 year time horizon and try and create profits in the backs of employees and at the expense of customer satisfaction. That's an interesting group to study, but that's not what we do in this paper. So here's an example of higher purpose. Okay. So this is a testimony that was given by Henry Ford in 1916, 1917. It was in connection with a lawsuit that was filed by 2 of the company's shareholders who were objecting to Ford cutting dividends. And what was interesting was that he had cut dividends, and then at the same time he had cut the prices of the Model T. And so these guys said that this doesn't make any sense because it's sacrificing shareholder value. And so they filed a lawsuit. And this is Ford's testimony. So once on the witness stand, Ford gave answers which their purpose was to please the public, could not have been better written by any PR expert. So the Dodge's attorney says, I'll ask you again, do you still think that those profits were awful profits? Well, I guess I do, yes, replied Ford. And for that reason, you were not satisfied to continue to make such awful profits, the lawyer asked. We don't seem to be able to keep the profits down, apologized Ford. Are you trying to keep them down? What is the purpose of the Ford Motor Company except profits? Will you tell me, Mr. Ford? Organized to do as much good as we can everywhere for everybody concerned. The dumbfounded attorney quit for the day. However, in his need to prove that a business firm's primary responsibility is to its stockholders, he came back to the attack. What he asked Ford is the purpose of the Ford Motor Company. To do as much possible for everybody concerned, responded Ford, to make money and use it, give employment, and send out the car where the people can use it. And incidentally, to make money. Business is a service, not a bonanza. Incidentally, to make money? Queried the attorney. Yes, sir. But your controlling feature is to employ a great army of men at high wages to reduce the selling price of your car so that a lot of people can buy it at a cheap price and give everybody a car that wants one. If you give all that, replied Ford, who must have felt that Stevenson had admirably stated his policies, the money will fall into your hands. You can't get out of it. So this was sort of an interesting example. Now, what I'm going to come back to a little bit later is that the line between what I call sophisticated shareholder wealth maximization, where you care about the customer and the employees, but the reason for doing it is to maximize shareholder value, and organizations and leaders who pursue a higher purpose, is often very blurred. And I'm going to share with you some interviews, and it's not easy to tell them apart. Okay, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on that. Here's another one. This is Chief Justice John Roberts in a talk to some lawyers in 2004. And he says those masons, the ones who built the great cathedrals, would spend months meticulously carving the gargoyles high up in the cathedral. Gargoyles that, when the cathedral was completed, could not even be seen from the ground below. The advocate must meticulously prepare, analyze, and rehearse answers to hundreds of questions, questions that in all likelihood will never actually be asked by the court. The medieval stonemasons did what they did because it was said that they were carving for the eyes of God. The advocate who stands before the Supreme Court also needs to infuse his craft with a higher purpose. He must appreciate that what happens here in mundane case after mundane case is extraordinary, the vindication of the rule of law, and that he, as the advocate, plays a critical role in that process. Okay, so these are just a couple of examples to illustrate some of the motivating thoughts that we had going into this research about what we mean by higher purpose. Right? Now, we use two approaches. We have a theoretical model that uses standard tools of economics. I promise I only have 1 or 2 slides on that. And then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the interviews that we did, and then I'll come back to some of the results from the model and connect them to what we heard in the interviews. All right, so the model, what does the model look like? So this is a standard principal agent model. It's sort of a standard tool of analysis in economics. We have 2 kinds of principals who hire agents. One is a type H principal who's driven by a sense of higher purpose. So this is someone who gets a positive utility from making investments in the higher purpose itself, and not just from the outcome of the investment, which is the business outcome that he gets. And the investments serve a business goal as well, output shareholder value, in addition to the higher purpose. And then we have another principle who's only motivated by wealth maximization. Okay? So this principle's goal is pure wealth maximization. And these are the two types of principles that we have. Okay? We have 2 types of agents. We have a type TH agent who gets some positive utility or satisfaction or joy from both from wealth and working to achieve this higher purpose. And the investments serve a business goal as well as a higher purpose. So there's a relationship in which, as the agent, I provide some effort, the principal makes some investments, and the effort and the investments go to both serve a business goal and also serve a higher purpose. And then we have the agents who are only interested in working for principals who are interested in just wealth maximization. So this agent gets utility only from wealth and doesn't like to work hard, everything else equal. So he's effort averse. Okay? And then in the paper, what we do is we solve for optimal contracts, investment levels, effort levels, and then we have some conclusions that I'll come back to a little bit later. Okay? All right, so let me share with you what we found in the interviews. Okay? Do we have the handout, Janet? Yeah, okay. Okay, so what Janet is going to do to you, we're giving you a handout. What I've done is just created a bullet point summary of the first 2 interviews so that you'll have them in front of you, and then we're going to do a little exercise at the table. But let me just read to you. So this is the CEO of a large financial services firm who Bob and I interviewed. And this was a 2-hour interview, so this is a brief excerpt from this interview. So Bob asked him, what are your first thoughts about the notion of higher purpose beyond the generation of wealth for the company? And he says, let me back up a bit. You know, we worked with Peter Drucker for a long time. At any rate, more important than that, which was an interesting sideline, we worked with Peter because our CEO was fascinated by his writings. He talked a lot about the mission of an organization, the purpose of an organization, why you exist. He insisted that the organization, ours for example, does not exist to create a profit. It is a necessary outcome without which you cease to exist, but it's not why you're in existence. That was a very, very difficult thing for us internally to get our arms around. This was back in the early 1980s. I came into our home office in '84 and started being a little involved, and then much more involved in the conversation in the late '80s and into the '90s. you have to look at our business file and how we're organized and whatnot. We have single profit centers with financial advisors. We don't have internal competing profit centers on the trading desk or anything like that. We just don't. So we focused all our energy as an organization on equipping, training, preparing, and supporting the financial advisor to work with individual investors. The measure of success had always been profits. How are we doing? Did we have a good year? What was the profit? It was a pretty easy, not appropriate, but pretty easy leap to say, well, we exist to create that profit. Drucker didn't tell us we were wrong. He just kept asking the question. I remember sitting in the room as he kept asking the question, which was kind of annoying, I think. I mean, come on. Again, why you exist? What's the purpose of your work? As Jim Collins would say today, what's the passion that brings you to work every day? We finally figured out that we exist to help individual investors reach their financial goals. I thought back at the time about how I introduced my elevator speech to a new prospect. You know, we walked into a community meeting, get together in an office or whatever, and somebody would say, so tell me, what do you do? You've got about 10 seconds, not 10 minutes. What I used to say was that I help people increase their income, decrease their taxes, and prepare for retirement. Not entirely correct. At that time, at the time that was comfortable for me, it was true. I don't think that today. Were I to be out there today, I would say I help people educate their kids and prepare for retirement. And that pretty much covers everybody. Educate the kids or the grandkids. You know, you can say we help people make money, but for what? They've got a purpose. They invest with a purpose in mind. They try to accomplish something. It's not just that I want to make 8%. No, I want to send the kids to college. They try to, I want them to have a choice of where they go. I want them to prepare for retirement so I don't have to move back in with the kids. So I've given you a handout which has sort of a summary. It doesn't have all of these details, but it has the essential points. I'm going to tell you about 2 more interviews. We've done 30, so I don't have time to tell you about all of them. There are some fascinating ones that are not included. But as I go through this, think about what these interviews are saying. What do they have in common? How do they differ? And to what extent can we distinguish between, you know, what's the higher purpose? And is this just a sophisticated form of wealth maximization? Or are they pursuing a higher purpose that goes beyond just wealth maximization? So just keep those thoughts in mind as I go along. Here is another interview, and this is with the CEO former CEO of a large industrial firm. This is an interview that I think lasted about 2.5 hours, and I had to actually leave for another appointment after about an hour and a half. And Bob was it. This is not the one where the CEO began to cry when you were, no, that was a different one. There was another interview which I couldn't do, and I was there for like 15 minutes, and I came back an hour and a half later, and Bob said, that was the most exhilarating interview, and he made this guy cry. And then I remembered that Bob is actually very good at doing that with executives. So, yeah, we were one of the great industrial organizations in the world measured by financial performance. The measure I'd chosen after a lot of thought was return on equity. But what I was doing was like what every CEO does, but even longer. That's what it's all about. I had a study I came across which said that they had convincing evidence that those companies that achieved 20% ROE and 10% growth per year at a market to book of at least twice the norm. So I said, okay, that sounds good. I started studying return on equity. We set the target. We're going to get there, and we kept pounding away at it. We did a lot of things and made it. I used to lecture on this interminably. I even got Bob Virgil, when he was the dean, here to come over and explain why 20% was the right number. So in this setting, I said, now the other part is a little bit harder. It's hard to measure behavior in society, but in our unique kind of company, one of those is the way we behave environmentally, the way that we behave towards our employees, and all the other people whose lives we intersect, the stakeholders. Then the first test came. At one time, the EPA required that all companies gather up their data on toxic emissions, all permanent, all legal, gather them up and report them as one number. I looked at those numbers and I said, holy crap. I hated the numbers. They were terrible. I hated them imagining what's going to happen. So I called in our VP of manufacturing and I said, tomorrow I'm going to announce these numbers, but I'm not going to announce them raw. I'm going to announce them with a pledge that in a certain number of years, I'm going to reduce them by a big number. And he said, okay, that makes sense. What do you have in mind? And I said, well, I'm thinking of 98% in 3 years. And he said, what? You don't have any idea how to do it, nor do I. And he said, how about, and he presented, he mentioned a much lower number that would put us in compliance with the EPA. I said, no, it's got to have a 9 in front of it. Are you going to listen to a deaf man with knives? So we settled on 90% in 5 years, and he badgered me to say at the end of 5 years, and I said, okay, end of 5 years. Anyway, the next day I announced that our emission numbers were lost in the incredible furor over this statement. It was on every television station. Then DuPont came out 6 months later with 50% in 10 years, or some such number. We had clearly stirred up something. The environmental community picked this up in a big way and urged people to take. Now, the reason why I'm disguising the names of the companies is we don't have permission to sort of share the interviews yet. We'll go back and get all that. But I still wanted to share the main content of this. And he says, go out and have this pledge. And we put out a report card every year, the pledge report, and there was no BS. How are we doing against the pledge? And then we added a pledge on groundwater, soil. Eventually, we had a whole range. There was just no BS on the numbers. Here's where we were. Here's what we did this year. And we reported it. So we started pledge awards. And once a year, we had a pledge. People got all caught up. I never had so many energized employees in my life. They became very proud. Something as good as this one. Their environment was the one that they came from, the same training as everybody else. They became very proud that they worked for this company in an industry that was built largely by the environmentalists. So they go, well, I work for XXX. Well, that's terrific. So I find myself being a consultant to Carol Broder, who was head of the EPA. At that time, you couldn't visit an executive of the EPA without an environmentalist in attendance, believe it or not the reverse, just when I went there. But she would call up and ask me what I think I'm going to do with my office. So they built this enormous relationship with the EPA. The whole organization was energized. They had tremendous results. And he saw a transformation of the culture of the organization that he said he had never expected when he made the pledge. Okay. All right, so that's the second interview, and that's also in the handout that you have. The third one, it's not in the handout. I'm just going to tell you the story because I know this well. This is a man named Jimmy Dunn, and Bob and I interviewed him in New York at his office. He is the CEO of an investment bank called Sandler O'Neill and Partners. It's a relatively, back in 2001, it was a relatively small investment bank, about 100 people. But they're the largest investment banks serving other financial service firms when they want to raise debt and equity capital. Right? So they work with a lot of banks and other financial service firms all over the country. And they were in the Twin Towers. On 9/11, they lost 2/3 of the firm, including 2 out of the 3 people who were responsible for the day-to-day running of the firm. The only one who was spared was Jimmy Dunn, who at that time was 45 years old. Not only did they lose 2/3 of the firm, they lost all their computers. So this was before the days in which everything was backed up remotely. So they lost all the trading records, they lost all their computers, they lost everything. So the financial viability, the survival of this firm was very much in doubt. And he's interesting. There's a course that I taught for about 6 years with the former CEO of Emerson, and he brought Jimmy Dunn in twice. And he's a fascinating man because he still to this day cannot say the words 9/11 without choking up. I mean, he literally has to stop and recover. So we went to interview him, and I'd heard one part of the story before. So what he did, of course, through the end of 2001, the company paid all the salaries and benefits of all the employees who had died. And then the next year, he called in a CFO and said, I want to pay the salaries and benefits through the end of 2002. And she said, well, I don't think that's wise. And he said, no, I didn't ask your permission. I just want you to run the numbers and tell me if the firm can survive if we do this. So she said, okay, I'll get back to you. They go and run the numbers, and she comes back, and the CFO comes back and says, yeah, we can survive, even though I advise against it. And he said, let's do it. End of 2002, he says, I want to do this again in 2003. pay all the salaries and benefits of all the employees who died. And she said, Jimmy, and he said, I want you to tell me if we can survive. And she said, look, you're not being responsible to the shareholders. This is fiscally irresponsible. And as CFO, I have to tell you that. And so he said, fine, you're right. So they're a private company. So he wrote a letter to all the partners who were the shareholders in the company and said, I plan to do this, but you have every right to object. And if you do, I'll let you redeem all your equity according to whatever formula they had. So they could take their money out. And he said, he told Bob and me, he said, I had no idea what I would have done if the majority of them had taken me up on the offer. Fortunately for him, he said nobody did. So they all kept their money in. Then he repeated this. So he does it for 3 years. He does it for 02, 03, 04, and all the equity partners remained engaged. Now, this is the story that he told us. The interview is over. Bob and I get up. We're about to leave, and he had his assistant. So this is the part of the story I knew because I heard it before. As we're about to leave, his assistant stands up and whispers something in his ear. And Jimmy turns to us and he says, oh, yeah, right. We actually did this for 10 years. But the reason why I didn't mention the remaining 7 years is that then it was easy because our financial survival was not at stake. It was only in the first 3 years that it was actually hard, right, to make a choice between the financial survival of the company and doing this. So after that, I knew that we were not risking the survival of the firm by doing this, so that's why. So he had been to our class twice, had never mentioned the 7-year part of it. And the first time I heard it was at that interview. So this was the third one. And this was an annual commitment. Now, there's a lot more to the story. There's actually a CBS 60 Minutes videotape on what happened to the company in the interview. It's on YouTube if you want to know more about this. But what is fascinating is what then happened to the employees and how it changed the organization and the support that he actually got from highly competitive competitors, other Wall Street firms. So it's a fascinating story, and one of the reasons why I shared this with you is that a Wall Street firm, an investment bank, is the last place where you would expect this, given the competitive nature of the business. So with that in mind, I've got a bunch of other interviews that I'll briefly share with you a little bit later. But let's see if we can take maybe 5 minutes. I've given you the bullet points in the first 2 interviews. I've shared the third story. What do you see as the key elements in these interviews? And, what are the common elements? Okay, and if we can then just briefly talk about them. Let's take about 5 minutes. Let's just do this at the tables. Yeah? Right? Yes, sir. Yeah. So in that first interview, what he told us was that Drucker actually never told them. So he never told them they were wrong, and he never actually gave them the answer. But he just kept pushing them, and so you guys got to come up with the answer. What's the purpose of your existence? Why was this company founded? What was the original? What is the passion that connects you to your job? And he said, we're the ones who finally came up with this notion that we exist to serve the financial needs of our clients. So that's sort of how it began. And it's been kind of the guiding philosophy of this company. There's an incredibly strong culture. So I've actually done a lot of work with them. And it's, even they'll admit that their culture is a little bit like a cult. Not everybody fits in there. And I know some people who basically, who went in there and just couldn't fit the culture. Because they really believe this stuff. And they walk the talk. In terms of serving client needs. Now, what's evolved over the years, and again, that answer didn't come from Drucker. Drucker just pushed them, just kept asking the question until they came up with an answer that he said, okay, that makes some sense. All right. Yes. So what did we come up with? We can either have volunteers or I can cold call. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
We came up with equally
as the common. So something that was deeply meaningful to the organization or the leader that then energized, that the organization responded to. Okay? Others? Yes?
The employees were the centerpiece of the company in this case, and there was some sort of motivation coming from whatever these leaders did.
Yeah.
Binding the employees to the firm or making them more motivated.
Yeah, so it was sort of interesting in that these people did certain things that went beyond or were distinct from the usual business goals. And one of the effects, maybe not even entirely anticipated, was the way that the employees in the organization reacted to it, which actually in the end ended up creating a lot of shareholder value for these organizations, even though that may not have been the initial purpose or the stated purpose. Okay? Others? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I would add one more thing, employees and customers. So one of the interesting things in the first interview when the CEO of the financial service firm said, he said, initially I thought about it as serving, we stated our higher purpose as serving the needs of our clients. And initially I stated this as reducing taxes, increasing wealth, return on investment, and so on. But then I don't put it that way now. I ask, what is the purpose, the purpose for which we're doing this for the client, and then trying to connect what we do to that purpose as opposed to this intermediate financial goal that we had stated initially, which to me was very interesting because I hadn't thought about it that way. Yes? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point, yeah. Right. So one way that a sense of higher purpose can emerge is in response to a crisis, right? And both these are examples. In fact, it's very interesting. Jimmy Dunn in the interview said that prior to 9/11, he said he had been very successful, they were sort of on cruise control. He was almost getting bored. And he was thinking about, I've made a lot of money. How long do I want to keep doing this? There was sort of restlessness in him. And he says, as much as, the event was so traumatic for him personally and for the organization, he says, there is not another minute of my life that I'm ever going to be bored. So I think that's really important. Yeah. Right, right. So these were truly stretch goals. I mean, they were doing things that you don't normally do in the normal course of events, and they actually shook the organization in ways that the organization hadn't expected. And then the leaders themselves were surprised by the reaction of the organization. In the 60-minute interview with Jimmy Dunn, I forget the name of the interview. I don't think it was Morley Schaefer, but whoever was interviewing him said, we talked a few months ago about your experience, and at that time you said you were confident that you would survive this crisis, losing 2/3 of the firm. I said, do you really believe that when you said it? And he said, no. But he says, I was the only person who knew that. And he says, are you surprised now? And he says, yeah, hell yes. And he was just shocked at how the organization reacted to some of the things that he did. It was very clear, I think, that he didn't know what was going to happen when he did these things. So he was taking a big chance. Right? So a lot of risk-taking. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, great point. We were discussing that earlier that, well, first of all, it has to be authentic. So a lot of companies, they say these things. It doesn't mean anything because they don't walk the talk. And then people in the organization realize it, and then it's just a bunch of words. It doesn't mean anything. But it has to be done from the top. I mean, culture, the tone for culture and what we do has to be. That's something that has emerged over and over again in our interviews. is the enormous role that the leaders of the organization played in the evolution of the culture that then led to these sorts of behaviors. So that was a very clear message. Yeah. I think the impetus for change has to come from the top. I think the leader has to stand up and say, this is where we're going, this is our purpose, this is our culture. One of the CEOs we interviewed said that we eventually decided that this is an agribusiness company, that the higher purpose for our organization was we're going to improve the global food chain, right? That's our higher purpose. Now, that's meaningless unless you're making some tough calls like Sandler O'Neill did, where there's a real choice, right? As long as there's no choice and it's completely coincident with shareholder wealth maximization, then there's no problem, right? That's what Jimmy Dunn said, that after the third year, it wasn't hard. So I don't even talk about what we did after the third year. But in the first 3 years, there was a real choice. So it has to begin at the top. But then I think, people follow the lead of the leaders. And then it sort of begins to permeate the organization. Anything else? Okay, yep. Yes, yes. Absolutely, absolutely. There was Bob has this wonderful line in his book, Deep Change, which I remember vividly because the course I teach, I talk about it every time, which is, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, which is, every now, you're not doing your job if every now and then you don't risk your job, right? Or something like that. And I think that, a lot of these people took a lot of personal risk in what they did in the interest of this higher purpose. And, I think Jimmy Dunn's story is the most moving, in my opinion, because for him, the survival of the firm was at stake. I mean, to me, that was unmistakably this choice between pursuing what he thought was a higher purpose and attending to shareholder value. In some of the other cases, those lines begin to get blurred, right? Yes? Right.
The more self-interested the logic becomes.
Yes.
The base logic, the base institutional logic is actually about other interests.
Right, right. No, that's very interesting. And it's true, and there's some other research about, how we react as individuals. And Bob and I were talking this morning about why is it, I think about sort of 3 types of companies. There are the myopic profit maximizers who attend to short-term profits at the expense of customers and employees. They're not part of what we do. Then there are sort of the long-term shareholder wealth maximizers who realize that they have to attend to customers and employees to achieve long-term value maximization. To me, that's true shareholder value maximization. Then you have this third group who are actually willing to sacrifice shareholder value to pursue a higher purpose, right? And the question we don't address here is what makes some people choose to be in that lowest group and others choose to be more long-term oriented value maximizers. And I think part of it is survival, right? If I have a 2-year time horizon, my firm is struggling, I'm on the verge of extinction, hanging on by my fingernails, I'm much more likely to be in that bottom group. And if I have a longer time horizon, like an Eisner and Disney, at least through the first 16 years, or Chuck Knight at Emerson for 27 years, where you take the long view. These people created enormous shareholder value, but they did it the right way, is I think you suspend fear and then you get more rational thinking. And then you sort of get a different set of outcomes. Yeah. All right. So, anyway, there are a few other interviews that I don't have time to go into. But you can see the different kinds of people we interviewed. So some of the common elements that we saw coming out of this is, number one, it's not always easy to distinguish between what I call sophisticated shareholder value maximization, where you attend to the needs of customers and employees, and the pursuit of higher purpose. So, the CEO of Panera, I came across a recent quote by him where he says, we're part of this conscious capitalism movement, and one of the worst things that has happened in corporate America is this obsession with shareholder value, which is completely wrong. And he says, I can't make stock price or profits. What I can do is make products that satisfy my customers and where I have engaged employees, and that's really how we should run businesses. No disagreement, but where I would disagree is that, to me, that's how you create shareholder value, is by attending to employees and customers. So obsession with shareholder value doesn't preclude attending to other stakeholders. It's part of the same game. But to me, he was talking about pursuing shareholder wealth maximization, not a higher purpose. A lot of these people talk about talent and people. The CEO of a shoe company, chairman of a shoe company, said, we all seek that differentiated place that our people and talent will give us, which is actually more important than just the bottom line, because the differentiated place would, in essence, give you the bottom line. So this, again, is a more sophisticated way of thinking about wealth maximization. Helping customers, I think this came up in all of the interviews. It's all about how we serve their needs. That defines our purpose. We exist to help individual investors reach their financial goals. Sandler O'Neill, there is sort of this implicit contract with employees. I would say that of all the interviews, this one is the hardest to argue that this was some sophisticated form of shareholder value maximization. I mean, clearly it was driven by something that transcended that. Yeah. I'm sorry? No, actually he risked the survival of the firm because he did that. Now, it turned out that a couple of years down the road, when the firm was sort of in survival mode, he was surprised at all of the reactions that it engendered. And he said, actually, their performance then outpaced that of their competitors. But it's not something that he could have expected. That was my point. So, clearly, there's a survivorship bias, right? No, I mean, obviously, for every Sandler O'Neill, there are probably others who took that chance and didn't survive, right, that I don't even know about, right? So there is no, that's why I don't want to be prescriptive here, right? I'm just giving examples. So, the doing what's right for society energizes your own people. The very interesting paper I came across this summer by a couple of professors at Gothenburg University, they call it the warm glow experiment, where they looked at, it's like a field experiment with two firms. And one firm, the profits are just retained by the owners, and the other firm, some of the profits, a major chunk of the profits are actually given to the Red Cross. And what they found is that they got much better results in terms of employee engagement and effort and output and costs and profits in the firm that actually gave money to the Red Cross, and the employees knew they were going to do that, so they call it this warm glow feeling. The agribusiness firm CEO said, do what's right for the country, industry, company, helping people as a way to self-actualize. So in our framework, you can think about the higher purpose principles as sort of pursuing the long view, and the wealth maximizers as pursuing the short view. Let me come back to some of the results from the formal model. So I've talked about the interviews. So one of the things that we find is that the pursuit of higher purpose reduces moral hazard within firms. It reduces the cost of labor, increases capital investments, but sometimes even beyond what is good for just shareholder value maximization. So there may be overinvestments in these higher purpose projects. So there may be overinvestments in higher purpose linked projects. The other interesting finding that we have in the model is that the presence of these higher purpose principles can actually relax budget constraints for the wealth maximizing principles. So they create a positive externality. and they actually increase the availability of resources. But here's another important result of the paper that I want to make sure I emphasize, which is we also find that when you need external financing to finance projects, those whose goal is solely to maximize wealth may actually be essential for the viability of those who are also pursuing a higher purpose. Okay? So in a financial market context, when you need external financing, you need some firms who care about nothing but wealth maximization. And that's their main goal. But again, remember, not myopic profit maximization, true shareholder value maximization. So, there is this book by Barbara Fredrickson on positivity that, for purposes of educating me, Bob strongly suggested I read to come up to speed in this area. And she has a wonderful line in there where she says, light needs darkness to flourish. And the same way, the higher purpose principles actually need these wealth maximizing principles to flourish. So you need both kinds of firms or principles in equilibrium. So there is sort of this symbiotic relationship between the pure wealth maximizers and the higher purpose guys, in that the higher purpose principles relax resource constraints for the wealth maximizers. The wealth maximizers actually enable access to external financing for the higher purpose principles. Yeah. No. It's a completely different result. So the relaxing of the budget constraints is what we find is that the higher purpose principles are actually willing to invest in early stage projects that the wealth maximizers would never invest in, which then leads to the creation of market conditions that enable the wealth maximizing. So it's like early stage R&D, certain kinds of product development, things that as a wealth maximizing person you would never do. So these are two different results. Yeah. Yes, sir. Well, there is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you need an equilibrium, you need a sufficient proportion of each, yeah. Otherwise, if you don't have the wealth maximizers, you may be shut off from external financing. If you don't have the higher purpose guys, there are a lot of investments that would never take place. The resource constraints would be a lot tighter. Yeah.
Well, what if there are some cases where pursuing the highest purpose was the most wealth maximizing thing to do?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And there may be instances, in fact, that is the standard economic reasoning, right? That typically, if everybody does what's right for them, as long as they're not creating sort of negative social externalities like polluting lakes and so on, then we get.
But I think in the reverse, let's say putting the highest purpose first
Uh-huh.
and doing something that benefits all the stakeholders in a way that reduces trade-offs. There are people there's a model of the firm, what I would call a newly emerging model of the firm that makes this argument, and going back to Drucker, that if you start with a customer-focused strategy,
Mm-hmm.
you end up with win-win outcomes for the other stakeholders, the members of the firm, the community, the investors, and the environment.
Right.
Because it leads to a new economics that reduces trade-offs. So that, I would say, would be the strongest argument in favor of the higher purpose argument that you're making.
Right. And so two things. One is that, again, the wealth maximization that we have in mind is one that does attend to the other stakeholders, like customers and employees, right? So it's sort of attending to them is a way to create sustainable value. But if you have instances where that's actually coincident with also being what I would call the best for the world, then it's great. Then there's no trade-off because you're serving both. And in the model, there are certain parameter ranges where there's actually no distortion. So you pursuing higher purpose and maximizing wealth are one and the same thing, but they're not always one and the same thing. So there are instances in which you may actually have to sacrifice on the shareholder value front to pursue the higher purpose. So I think, yeah, okay, so let me just wrap up just the last one. So what we find is that leadership driven by higher purpose can facilitate meeting major societal challenges. You can reduce conflict, moral hazard, other transactional frictions. But this may involve some sacrifice in shareholder value as well. But again, the important thing is that you need both the wealth maximizers and the higher purpose pursuers. Okay? That's all I got.